go ahead and get started. So thank you so much to Sara Hart for giving this workshop on how to do a review. I think she'll be the perfect person, especially now that she's a new editor of infant and child development. So congrats. And I'll give the floor to you.
Yeah, thanks. And yes, everybody should be submitting their work to infant and child development. Okay, let me share my screen. I'll share my screen first before I start talking. Let me share the screen, these slides. And pop them in the chat here. You want to click on links and things. Okay. Myself, my screen's organized. It's like my first day using Zoom here. Okay. Interestingly enough, if I'm not sure if some of you may know that I have a podcast with a colleague, Jessica Logan, and we like to talk about professional development topics. And the podcast is called What's in Between. It's looking at the methods and meta science of developmental science. But interestingly, reviewing papers, and I also teach a professional development class here at FSU to graduate students. But interestingly, reviewing papers is a topic that I have never actually done any professional development training on. So I was asked to do this topic, I was like, okay, well, I've actually never given a talk on this topic before. So I put together these slides. Admittedly, this is a little bit of a busy time, and I just put together some thoughts and to kind of get some feedback on how this professional development is working and what your questions you all have. So I'm really happy to get questions all the way through to get clarification, so it can help me kind of refine how I may talk to other people about reviewing papers. Because admittedly, I was never trained on how to review a paper. And I've never trained anybody else on how to review a paper, including my students, which is something that I often think about is lacking in the advising that I give my own students. But it's sometimes you just run out of time, which is, I think, why we're having this session, because realize that not very many people get training in reviewing a paper. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, I guess I wanted to kind of give my context or my lens of where I'm coming from. What I'm going to talk to you about in my recommendations come from my experiences reviewing myself and editing. I've been an editor for psychology journals and quantitative education. I've always done quantitative education type papers at educational journals. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. Last month or so, I put out a couple of tweets asking for general advice on what people advice on, reviewing papers in the format of reviews. And so I linked you to the tweets and you can see the responses, and I used some of those responses plus my own experiences to put together these slides. Okay, my co-host of my podcast is here visiting me. We're working on a big grant together. And so she's just down the hall from me right now. And she reminded me to show you guys the Shit My Reviewers Say Tumblr, which she is actually one of the administrators for. So you may want to click on that and check it out and laugh. At what this is people anonymously submit actual reviews that they've received, text from reviews, and it's a funny Tumblr, and then it gets tweeted out as well from a Twitter account. And this is a good example. Many of these, pretty much all of them, are good examples of what not to do when reviewing. And it pretty much comes down to don't be an asshole. Give in your reviews, be thoughtful and use language that you would want to read if you were receiving reviews, and if it is going to be criticism, constructive criticism and the like. And so you can have a good laugh at reading through some of these absolutely terrible reviews that people have gotten, because sometimes you just have to kind of like laugh and just shake your head because something is just so, you're like, I can't believe somebody just said that to me. So anyway, there you go. You can scroll through that as I'm talking and know what not to do when reviewing a paper. Okay, so I really thought, I know this is the MCLS trainee call, and so I'm really kind of taking that perspective that probably many of you have not done a review before, and you might not even know the process of what happens with a review and how you even get asked. I want to make sure kind of I pitched this correctly. Maybe it'll be easier if you want to raise your virtual hand if you have done a review before. Okay, so that's good. So what? Oh, people are coming in, but it looks like more than half the call I think has not done one, and a good large double handful has done a review. So for those who've done it before, just kind of hold out as we talk through a little bit of what happens initially. So what happens is you will just suddenly one day get an email in your email asking you to review a paper. And so that email will typically have the abstract of the paper, which is why when you submit a paper, if you ever notice, you have to cut and paste an abstract into a separate field. It's because they use that field in the automatic email that goes out to reviewers, and they send out the abstract to reviewers. And you will get that abstract, and you'll get a time frame for when they want your review back. And depending on the journal, there's different time frames. And it's a good reminder here to know that those time frames are typically suggestions at best, but gives you an idea if the journal is expecting reviews to be turned around in like a week, or if they give a month or longer for your review. And then in the email, you can usually hit a link that will allow you to either accept the paper review or decline the paper review kind of from the email. Sometimes you have to log in, sometimes you don't, but that's generally the format of how you receive a review to review a paper. If you accept the review, what will happen is you'll get a follow-up email with access information to the full paper. So you can then access the full manuscript. And if you decline, you'll often get sent to a website that asks you to recommend others to do the review, since you're not able to do it. And it's not necessary, but it's greatly helpful if you know others in the area to suggest their names. Especially other junior colleagues. I always usually recommend junior people in that field to get experience and just to get them on the radars of editors that, people with this expertise exist. I realized in this email and this slide, I didn't let you know kind of what happens on the other side of things. What happens is there's an editor of a journal. There's the main kind of editor-in-chief, and then there's usually associate and assistant editors underneath the editor-in-chief. And what they do is they get the manuscript. They decide if the paper is going to go out for review, and if the paper goes out for review, then they run through their mental Rolodex of who they know in that area that could review that paper. And when I'm an editor and I'm thinking about, okay, I want to make sure I cover the method, somebody I know that knows the method, somebody I know that knows the content area, and maybe somebody that can cover both if I need 3 reviewers. Or if I need 2 reviewers, then I definitely make sure the content and the methods are covered by my reviewer expertise. So as you publish more and as you give talks more at conferences or posters more at conferences, and people start to get to know you and get to know what your area of expertise is, then that's when you're going to start to get review requests, because editors are trying to match people who will say yes to the content and methods expertise of that paper that they're trying to get reviewers for. Okay, any questions so far about why one of these emails will suddenly end up in your inbox to review a paper and what it looks like? No? Again, happy to receive. I'm watching the chat's over here, not over here, but Oh, yes, yes, the classic pre-email. I'm looking at the chat right now, where uh, often how you know a review request is going to come in is you get an email previously that says your name has been registered in an online system at a journal. And that means an editor is going ahead and putting your contact information into the online system so that they can then initiate the review request to you. And they're often the two emails you'll get the, here, you've been registered to this new system, comes approximately 1 minute before the email to review a paper comes. So my stomach always drops when I get one of those emails. I'm like, uh-oh, here it's coming. Okay, so I think it's kind of important to talk about when to say yes about reviewing. And so I wanted to cover that before we even get into the mechanics of how a review works. So what you'll find earlier in your career, which I assume most of the people on this call are, is that you'll first not get a lot of requests to review papers until you start publishing. Then you'll start to get more and it will start to build up. But when you do get asked to review, you'll find that it's probably not quite in your area of expertise. You may get asked to review something that's like broadly in like math cognition or math education and not your sub area. Like, well, no, I'm an expert in math anxiety. I don't know anything about, you know, like how numbers develop in 3-year-olds. But, you know, this is what happens when you're first starting your career and people know generally they've seen you at MCLS. And that, you know, you're in the field enough. And let's give you a try as a reviewer and send out a review request. You'll also find earlier in your career that you'll get review requests from journals that you may have never heard of before, or kind of lower on like the prestige scale or the impact factor scale, or however you decide that. Or as I put in the slide, less fancier journals. So my advice, at least generally, especially as you're getting started, is if you're comfortable with the journal, so sometimes you will probably, not sometimes, often you'll probably get review requests from a journal that you've really never heard of before, or you've heard bad things about. There's predatory journals these days, and you may not be comfortable reviewing for that journal, or you may not be comfortable reviewing for a journal that requires to publish your name with your review. So for example, the Frontiers journals do that. And so if you're comfortable with the journal and you think it's close enough to what you do, and I would say math cognition is probably close enough to your area of expertise for all of you, or cognitive development generally, or education generally, that you should probably say yes for the experience if you have the time, and that's coming up later. Because one of the great ways to be a better writer yourself is to read lots of writing. And, you know, you're probably your own advisors are telling you to, you know, read the literature a lot to get to know the literature. And reviewing papers is a really great way to get to know the current literature in your field, right? They're reviewing, like, as of right now, here's what, you know, the cutting edge of kind of science in your broad field would be. And so a journal review can be a useful experience for that reason. So the next component is, not only are you comfortable that you should do it, but also do you have the time? I think it's important to consider, maybe not right now, or, you know, this is a good time. I do have time to add this into my calendar, and to not take on a review, even if you're excited about it, even if you really want to do it, if it's going to be completely overwhelming to you, because this is extra service. You know, this is not getting you a publication. It's not getting you to the next step in your job or advancing in your PhD or whatever it is. And so, you know, consider if you have the time. I gave a general rule of thumb, but to be honest, I think that there's going to be a lot of individual differences in how long it will take you to do a review. But when you're starting out, it probably will take you approximately half a day to do a review. And so you need to determine if you have that sort of time on your calendar in the time frame that the journal wants the review back in. So can you find that time and say the next month or whatever, or if the journal is one of those ones that likes a week-long turnaround, can you find that time in the next week to complete the journal review without, you know, overworking, going bananas to try to get it done? I will say that many people that responded to my tweet when I asked about what, their advice about reviewing, said that they like to do a review in multiple sittings. I said setting. That should be sitting. You might like alternate settings as well. Maybe a coffee shop one day and your office another, but really sitting. I've always preferred to do my journal reviews in one sitting. I just do it all. But some people prefer to do multiple sittings. And actually, how I review grants is in multiple sittings. I can't review a grant in one sitting. I have to read it, take some time off, and come back to it. And that's what some people do for journal reviews as well. And that may be you. Experiment with it. Some people like to kind of consolidate and think about what they've read in their first reading and then come back and read a paper again before writing up their review. Generally, like I said, once you do start publishing, you're going to be asked to review. It will get more and more you'll be asked to review. Currently, at this stage in my career, I get asked to review maybe 3 to 5 times a week, which is, way more than I could. And it's just because people know me and know my expertise. So I'm at the top of minds of editors to send me a review request. So that will just happen gradually as you start to publish. As a little heads up, some of you may have gotten a review request from me from the Journal of Numerical Cognition, because when I get a topic, what I do is I go to the MCLS program and I search the program for people who presented something in the previous year or two on that topic, and I send out review requests to those people. So that's another way that you might, Journal of Numerical Cognition is our society journal. And so that may be where some of your first review requests come from, is JNC. Or for the few who are at my institution, like Rachel, and I know their expertise because they're students here, you'll also get hit up by editors. So if you have a professor or a colleague who is becoming an editor somewhere, know that review requests are coming your way pretty soon. But otherwise, as you start to publish, people will find you and start to give you more review requests. A good rule of thumb that I try to follow loosely, but it's kind of a nice way of thinking about giving back, that, again, this is volunteer service in our community. It is, there's a whole other debate that we can have outside of this call about whether reviewers should be paid or not. And that is a raging debate on Twitter. If you like to really kind of dig into a thorny issue, dig into that one. But I think it's an important service to our field, and it's a service that I should contribute to because I'm publishing papers and people review my papers. So then I should give back to the community. It's a socialist system. A good rule of thumb is approximately 2 to 3 reviews for every paper that you submit, is a good kind of way of thinking about, how you should be giving back to your community. Okay. So that's when to say yes, and factors to think about before you say yes to reviewing. It is totally normal and okay to say no. And that's like a regular part of editors' jobs, is to get no's from people at any career stage. But especially earlier in your career, saying yes is I think, a great, well, anytime in your career, saying yes is a good idea. But, if you can do it, then say yes, and I think you'll find it very worthwhile. Okay. I'm going to stop again before I move to the next slide. Any questions at all? Check over here in the chat. Okay, so let's say you've got your email asking if you want to review, and you click that yes button, and you're going to review. What you'll get is the access to the full manuscript. Typically in our field, it's a blinded manuscript, not all the time. But you'll get access to kind of the stripped down title page and the full manuscript, and you'll get a deadline and the follow-up email that you get sent from the journal that will give you a deadline of when they want their review. I recommend that you have a system for keeping track of those deadlines. It's easy to lose track of it because the email, you just delete the email or it gets lost somewhere. Some systems I've heard of, some people I know, as soon as they get a review request, they print out the paper that they want to review because they prefer to review on paper, and maybe write the deadline on the paper, and they have like a stack of them on their desk, and they just watch the deadlines for that. I have a system where I know personally I can't do more than 1 review a week, and so I carve out a time in my week. It's usually, other than the last year or so, it's always been kind of Friday mornings. That's a good time for me to be doing reviews. And so I always have a Friday morning slot on my calendar that is ready for a review. And so if I have an open Friday morning slot when a review request comes in that I accept, then I put it into my calendar. I attach into my calendar the email from the journal that has the access information to the paper. And I pick a calendar day, like I pick a Friday slot that is within the deadline of that paper, so that I know, oh, I'm looking at my calendar for this upcoming week. I can see I have a paper I have to review for JNC this Friday, and I do it during that slot on my calendar that Friday. And so that's how I keep track of the deadlines. But however you do, just kind of, it's easy to lose track of these deadlines. So have a system for how you'll keep track of your reviewing deadlines. Okay. Now into actually doing the review. All of this was kind of setting you up to the review. Here we're talking about doing the review. I think a decision point for you, and I really think that this is a personality indicator, it should probably be part of some personality test, is whether you're going to be a reviewer who makes notes of typos and APA citation mistakes. It seems to kind of split. You're either a reviewer who will do that or you'll not. You decide who you're going to be. I am not. I will not point out typos. I will not pick out APA citation mistakes. I see it all the time from reviews that I get in as an editor, that people have a long list of here are typos I've seen. On my Twitter thread, somebody noted how much they love receiving that information from reviewers to find their typos and their APA mistakes. And they appreciate it so much that they've become a reviewer that does that now. It's up to you. Know that it's not a requirement as part of a review. That level of detailed kind of, copy editing information back to an author is not necessary, but some people choose to do it and some people don't. Know that every paper before it gets published does go through copy editing. So, take that information as you will. Also, some other overall review thoughts. Signing your review is not necessary, especially if you're on academic Twitter. You'll see there's always kind of every few times a year a conversation is had about whether you should sign your review or not. In my personal opinion, I don't think it's a good idea to be signing reviews as a junior investigator in the field. I understand psychology enough to know that, grudges can become a real thing, even if you have a review in the most, constructively critical way that you possibly can. So I generally, don't recommend signing a review, but that's your own personal, decision point, but know that it's not necessary or required to do a review. What is required, though, it's not actually required, but should be required, is be kind. Don't be the reviewer that ends up on shit my reviewer says. So write the review like you are going to sign it, but know that you don't have to sign your review in the end. It can be anonymous. Another point that somebody said on my Twitter thread that I completely agree with is that you're a reviewer and not a co-author. Sometimes people view the reviewing role differently, but in my opinion, you are not a co-author, you are a reviewer, and there is a difference between those roles. So in my opinion, it is not your job as the reviewer to redesign the methods or redesign the study or rewrite the study. Okay, you can point out that the methods, there's a critical flaw in the methods. You can point out that there's a better way to do the method. You could give some citations even of, look, check this out. This is kind of the current, thinking about this method. You could point out that the paper is difficult to read. You can point out that the literature review does not lead to the research questions and the like, but you don't need to do the literature review. You don't need to give them 10 citations of what they should read to have a better literature review. Those are co-author jobs, and that's not your job as a reviewer. Also, my own personal viewpoint about reviewing is that I don't view myself as a gatekeeper to science. I am not personally that interested in what is my viewpoint of what's innovative or not, or what's new, or what hasn't been done, or what's cutting edge. I think that if the science is sound and the methods are good, then it deserves to be published. And so I don't personally gatekeep whether, if the study has been done and a few other samples, as long if it's cited and a literature review is there and it's contextualized within those other papers, I don't care about things like being the first to publish something. So I really focus on design and methods in my review and look to make sure that the statistics, are good, the methods are good. There's no fundamental flaw in the conclusions that can be made from the data as it's presented. And that's where I focus my review. This is, again, kind of overall opinions. And some people do view themselves as gatekeepers as a reviewer. And some of that is kind of, you have to decide yourself what kind of reviewer you're going to be. Some people think that it's really important that, really incremental science is not necessary and is maybe flooding our journals. Again, that's not my viewpoint, but these are decisions that you can make as a reviewer, and you may even change in your career of your viewpoint of yourself as a reviewer and your role as a reviewer. Also, a good thing to remember, and this is hard, especially when you're junior, but I still do it all the time too, is that if I can't understand what I'm reading in a paper, it's not me. It's not because I'm not smart. It's not because I don't know that research area. It's not because I'm just too tired or I need a little bit more coffee. It's the authors didn't write clearly enough. And so I have stopped trying to understand papers that I don't understand, really digging in and being like, if I read it a third time, I'm going to understand it this time. And I just write, my review is the clarity of the writing could be more clear. It was difficult to understand what was happening, and I couldn't give a full review because I couldn't get past the kind of the clarity problems with the writing. Okay. So those are general review thoughts and kind of how I think of myself as a reviewer as I'm starting the process to do the review. Okay, so now we're getting into the review. So a common review format, and as you submit more papers, you'll see different reviewer formats, like what the structure of a review looks like that you get. But a common kind of structure or format for a review is to start with a short paragraph that summarizes the paper. It's kind of like an annotated bibliography, or think about like 4 sentences describing the 4, summarizing the 4 sections of the paper, followed by typically a bulleted or numbered list of comments and concerns. The ordering of that numbered or bulleted list is typically either major and then minor concerns, or sometimes it's in kind of chronological order of your paper. So starting from the front of the paper, going to the back of the paper, here's just a list of the things that I have to say as I go, as I'm reading the paper. So you can do it kind of in the order of the priority or the order of the paper, and that's up to your own personal style. It's sometimes helpful to say to the authors which order you're using. I typically do kind of more major concerns and minor concerns, and then within the major concerns, they're in kind of chronological order of the paper. Is typically how I do my reviews. I would highly recommend that when you're writing your review, you do it in a Word document and not in the online system, because the online systems don't save your work as you go, and it's really easy to lose multiple paragraphs of your writing when a website crashes or your Wi-Fi goes in and out. So do your whole review on a Word document before you submit it to the online system for the journal. So that's kind of the last step. It's a cut and paste from your document and put it into the online system. You don't need to do that initial 1-paragraph review. I've actually never have in my career. I think I'm a little bit unusual for that, but I just never really saw the sense of it. I'm like, why do I need to summarize in a paragraph what I just read and what you wrote back to the authors? But a lot of people in my Twitter thread talk about how they like to do that because it really kind of gets their head straight about what the paper is about. And if they can write a short paragraph about what the paper is about, then they know that they've read it properly and they do understand the study enough to review it. So personal style, but I would say probably most reviews of the ones that I see, I'd say like 75 to like 90% of the reviews I see do have that short paragraph review of like summary of the paper before then listing of the concerns and general comments about the paper. My process is, well, when I was first starting, my process was I would read the paper twice. So I would read it first, just to understand the whole study, right? So kind of start to finish, an initial read to get to know it, and then start again and read it again, making comments this time of like, okay, this is my comment that I'm going to make in the review. Oh, I like to do it on hard draft on paper, but generally I like when I'm reading, I'm better with paper. It slows me down. And then, I don't know, the internet is on my computer if I'm reading something on my computer. So then I'm on the internet, and next thing you know, I'm on Twitter without even realizing it. So I like to print it out and do it on and write it on my desk. And I write comments and thoughts as I go. I don't necessarily always translate those comments and thoughts into my actual written review, because sometimes I'm like, they've messed this up. And then like 3 pages later, I realize that it was my misunderstanding, and I go back and I like cross that off. So just my kind of my oral commentary as I'm reading through the paper that I'm writing on the paper. And so then after you've read it, either, twice probably, or if you're good, if you do a good solid initial read and that's all you need, then that's your process. You read it once. Then I open up a Word document and I just start writing my comments. I start at the big, the start of my front page of my paper, and I just flip through the pages and I look at my notes in the margins. And I'm like, okay, I made this note. I actually made it in multiple places within the document. It's all this general theme. So I'm going to write just a general kind of single, criticism or a suggestion based on this theme and point out the areas that I thought. Or this one note is its own bullet point, but it's a minor concern bullet point or whatever. And I just go through and I convert my notes from the written document to my Word document review in my bulleted list.
There's a question in the chat,
Yes.
Sarah.
Good. Yeah, I read it from beginning. So the question is, do you read the paper from beginning to end? That's how I read it, because that's how I tend to read papers generally, is from beginning to end. There were a few, I'm trying to think back to that Twitter thread. I think a few people said that they don't actually read it from beginning to end. Some people read an abstract, and then they go to like the figures first and the data first, the tables, to kind of see what's going to get set up, and then they go back to the introduction and read from there. I would say, you all at this point, I'm sure, have lots of practice of reading empirical papers, and you probably have your own little tricks for how you like to read them. And it will probably be the same trick that you use for when you're reading a paper to review it. So I've always just started at the start and read all the way through. But some people maybe skip to the research questions and then read the methods first and then go and the results and then go back to the introduction. I think there's all kinds of different ways to read a paper. So I would say probably, again, whatever process you read. So if you're reading for like a seminar class or you're reading for a literature review yourself, it's probably going to be a similar way that you read the paper when you're reviewing it. In the order, in the end, you're going to have to read the whole paper to review it. And so the order is kind of up to you. Other questions about doing the review? I have one more kind of general, one more slide, kind of like of what to look for generally. Oh, no, this one. So some things you might think about as you're reviewing a paper is kind of the same things that you think about when you're generally reading an empirical paper and determining if you think that the paper is like convincing evidence to you, right? So like, do the authors support the research questions and hypotheses with their literature review? It's actually remarkably common for me to review papers that the literature review sets up something completely different than what the research questions are. When you're like, this is a nice literature review, it's well written, but like does not lead to the research questions. The research questions were kind of surprising based on the 5 to 10 papers that I read before them. So kind of thinking through that, like, okay, was there an evidence base that led to these research questions or hypotheses? Another area that I think about when I'm reviewing a paper is, do the methods test the research questions? So, okay, the authors have set up research questions. Do they then use a method that can properly test their research questions? And it's, remarkably common as well for that to be the case, that, this research question, it's a great research question. It was set up by the literature review, but like this method can't test it. You're talking the whole literature review and your research questions were how, numbers develop. But the method is a cross-sectional sample, the authors use a cross-sectional sample of 15-year-olds. You're like, well, that's not, I don't think that's the right sample to test the research questions that they want to test, So are there methods testing the proper research question? Are the results accurately written with the information you need? Okay, can you interpret and understand the results based on how they're written? Have they given you all of the output from the statistical tests that you need to evaluate those statistical tests? Do they actually test their research questions properly? Not only their method, but their statistical tests, like does their sample, the approach, and then does the statistical tests themselves test their research questions? Does the discussion follow what the results actually say? Like, okay, here's what they found. Here's what was statistically significant or not. Here's what had larger effect sizes or not. Is that all properly discussed in the discussion? Is it contextualized appropriately with the limitations from the method or the sample that they use, or any other limitations from their statistical test? Do they not overstate their findings? It's actually relatively common. I do generally sometimes review papers where they overstate their findings based on my impression of the data that they're giving me. But actually what's more common typically is I thought other areas in their data that I thought was interesting and they don't discuss it, that I thought kind of could support their literature review, support their research question, or just interesting generally to contextualize in the discussion, and it's not in the discussion. So often sometimes I point out, like, I think this is interesting too, or this was helpful too, or the lack of a finding here may also be something that you use to contextualize, because you focus on only the statistically significant things, and you kind of miss this other, why was it not here, sort of thing. And it's also okay. Know that I love statistics. I've had a lot of training in statistics. I like advanced methods, and so I do focus on the results section and the statistical analyses used. But know that it's okay if that's not you. If you're not as comfortable with statistical methods, or you're kind of still earlier in grad school and still taking a lot of classes, that it's okay that if you're not familiar with the statistical methods themselves and you're not comfortable being a critical reader of the statistical methods and not giving feedback on their accuracy. In those cases, like when I get papers that use a method that I don't understand, a statistical method I don't understand, I explicitly say that I am not going to give feedback on the accuracy of the statistics. I just say it. I still think that you should understand them enough. You need to be able to understand the data in the results section enough to then know that the discussion is properly contextualized and reviews those results appropriately and doesn't overstate the findings. So you should kind of generally be able to glean from the statistical analyses what the results were, so that you can understand the discussion. But it's okay to say that you're not going to be a technical reviewer of the statistical analyses as it was. That's not your area of expertise. And I see that in reviews, and I do it in reviews myself occasionally. So it's okay to say that. Okay, it's generally what I was going to tell you all about how a review works. So any questions about the act of doing the review? Yes. What do you do if a paper seems unsavable? First of all, don't waste your time on it. Those are quick reviews. Do not let yourself fall down the hole of being a co-author and try to save it. Okay, so if you think it's unsavable, if you think commonly it's referred to as having like a fatal flaw, if you think there's a fatal flaw in the method, then like that no amount of reanalyzing the data is going to solve this paper. There was like the sample was incorrect, or the sampling was incorrect, or whatever it is. Then you just kind of state that and what I have done typically in those cases, you normally kind of see it once you get to the methods results section. And once you get to the end of the results section, you're like, this is not savable. Then I just write if I have some comments from the introduction, I might give it to them, but otherwise tell them about the fatal flaw and say that I have not read the discussion. I just explicitly say that I didn't even go on to the discussion. I just stopped my review there. And then you recommend typically a rejection. Yeah. So I just stop reading. Once I see something that is not, that the authors will not be able to get over, I stop reading. I put it in my review, how far I got, what the fatal flaw was, and that's it. Now there's earlier in your career, you're going to see more of this for sure. Later in your career, you're not going to get those papers as much. So I no longer get those papers, to be honest, as much. What I more often see is that the data collected is okay, but I don't agree with their modeling that they did, the statistical modeling, or there's a better modeling approach. And so that in the end, the authors could still use their data. They could even still use the literature review to the research questions, but they have to redo their model. And in those cases, I make it clear what I think the appropriate model is and why, maybe give a citation or two as to like why I say that. But then I leave it up to the editor to make the decision. And that's kind of my next point. The review, as a reviewer, you're not making the decision as to what the next steps for this paper are. You're just reviewing kind of the scientific quality of the paper as you see it. And then it's the editor's decision if a wholesale remodeling of the data constitutes a rejection or not to that journal. And different journals have different viewpoints on that. So, I'm an associate editor at developmental psychology, and that will probably get you a rejection because we're kind of too competitive of a journal to see you completely redo all of the modeling with different data and a revision. That's probably too much of a revision. But some journals, that might be an okay revision. As a reviewer, it's not your job to decide that. It's just to say either it's a fatal flaw, it's totally done, or the models themselves are actually a flaw, that it's not going to work, but it's not a fatal flaw. The authors could redo it, do different models, but it's going to result in a different result section and a different discussion section. And then it's up to the reviewer, the editor, to decide from there.
I have a question about how you handle or how you would recommend folks handle, like, so when you review a paper and it's ultimately rejected, and then you're asked to review that same paper by a different journal.
You know what's funny? Has this happened to you before?
Yes, and in fact, I just got one in my inbox from one that
That's so funny. You know, I have never had it happen to me in all these years of my career. Yeah, and I'm like, is this just like folklore? So I haven't had it happen. I have seen many a discussion on academic Twitter about what to do, and it seems like pretty commonly what the thinking behind it is it's totally okay to resubmit the same review. You might give it a glance. I know when I revise and resubmit a paper when I get a rejection and submit to a new journal article, I, talk to my lab about, okay, let's take the comments that we think are good comments, or like, oh yeah, we screwed up there, or we can make it better, and make those changes and then resubmit. So as a reviewer, you might check like, oh, did they make use of any of my previous comments? You don't just cut and paste necessarily your same review, just see if they've made those changes. Then I would do a quick skim through. To be honest, I would not do the full read. I would just skim to see if they made any changes. And if not, you can submit your review with your previous review and kind of start with a preamble that you reviewed it you had previously reviewed this paper. Some people say you could just contact the editor and say that you had reviewed it before and there hadn't been any changes, and you plan to submit the same review again. And is the editor okay with that before you submit your review? But yeah, it's okay to kind of reuse it again.
Okay, thanks.
And you may actually even double down then. I mean, the reviewers are kind of really effed up if they've missed the major stuff where you're like, this is a pretty key point. It got you rejected the previous journal. So you're like, my opinion still stands on this very important point in your review.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I have another question if no one else does, but I don't want to.
Yeah, happy to take it.
So I, like, admittedly, I review a lot, too much actually, but recently, like in the last several weeks, I've noticed this change at a few of the journals I review for regularly, and I think developmental psych might be one of them, but I'm not sure. this change from the open-ended box to like input your review in plain text to like 8 questions about like, are the tables and figures clear? Are the limitations adequately discussed, etc. And the first time this happened to me, I was like super frustrated because I didn't know before I wrote the review and wrote it in my standard way, and then had to like re-copy paste into all these new boxes. And this is where I think it was developmental psych recently. It like happened on an R&R. And so I just ignored all the boxes and said, see my comment below, and just put like a plain text comment below. Do you have an opinion on like, it feels like a recent, so maybe, I don't know if it's like maybe an APA thing or something. And so maybe it's all of the APA journals I review for, I'm not sure. But I've noticed it more in several different journals over the last few weeks. And I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah. I haven't noticed a developmental psych that we have that change in how
Okay, so maybe it's not, I might be
yeah.
misrepresenting that.
Yeah, I know. I went back and forth as to whether to get into this in my slides, and I didn't. So I'm happy you brought it up because it's clear I should have. Yeah, it's common, and that's going to be kind of the next, like how to submit your review. And maybe I'll just quickly kind of, you all can read this as I'm talking, at least how to submit your review, that you'll take your Word document and cut and paste it into a box, like we're talking about this plain text box. And some systems have these odd questions that you have to answer, and about the review, about the paper themselves, But what you're thinking you're talking about is not necessarily just those questions, which are awful to begin with, but it sounds like specific questions that they want you to answer and structure your review, which journals like Frontiers has always done. And I've noticed a couple other kind of specialty journals have that as well. And it's, and yeah, usually I get obnoxious and completely ignore it, like you said, and just say, I'm just going to put it out my whole review here and not separate into the various boxes. Frontiers like really does want you to do that. But most journals that you review for, like that's normal. For the Arial button, like what's the quality? Yes to no, I feel the same way. This is recommendation letter season here in the US, at least for graduate school applications. And they have all those questions about what you're feeling about the students is that are completely, like useless. I know aren't used. As an editor, know that I don't use those Arial button responses either. I just look at the narrative review. And so what I sometimes do is I'm just like a total like ass about it and just click all the way down, just click a number, and then write in the box of the editor that I just clicked a random button all the way through, and then I didn't actually answer those questions in a reasonable way. So I just make sure somebody knows that I did that just to get through that part of the requirement of the system. So that's kind of how I would do it, because to me, if I already did the free labor of doing the review, don't make me restructure my review into whatever you think. But if it's a low bar to change it, like, okay, I'll just cut this one comment and put it here and cut this comment and put it here, then I might do it. But I pretty much at this stage of my career get a little belligerent. I'm like, you'll just get it how I'm going to give it to you without trying to hurt authors. I am always thoughtful about authors. I know publishing is, make or break in so many careers. And so I'm not trying to hurt authors by that, but otherwise it's just the system and how the system wants it. I just make the system work how I want to make it work. That's my own personal viewpoint. Yeah. So it kind of sounds like how you've been approaching it as well. But
yeah, I just checked. It was, so I reviewed for both JECP and DevPsych last week, and it was the JECP that requested it. So I think I messed those two up. Yeah, but it is less like those buttons, which like lots of journals do. And I also just give some like vague interpretation, but this is more like trying to help folks structure their review, I think, which on the one hand I can kind of get behind, because it's like, well, at least it like forces reviewers to comment on all of these things. It's just not how I've been writing my review, like in that format, right? Of like copy pasting specific comments in specific ways.
Yeah, and I think I should change these slides, and maybe I will. If you guys, you'll always have the link here. You can revisit these slides, and maybe I'll put in this. I'm going to change the slides a little bit earlier to make it clear that in that initial email that you get from the journal, they often give you information about the format of the review that they're expecting. At this point, I just like assume I know what the format is, but that assumption is probably not an accurate one. And that it may be worth your like 2 seconds to like check to see what the review format that the journal is going to want to see. And so I'll put that up in an earlier slide of like what happens when you say yes, that you may just take 2 seconds as you're like scheduling when the review is going to occur, that you just, you know, have a note that you should also double check before you start your review what the format that journal is going to want your review in. The suggestions of like the preamble, summary text, and then bullet points afterwards, it's still the majority typical format that most journals will take. But I'll put the qualification in that some journals are moving away from that typical format and asking specific questions for you to respond to. And you should pay attention before you start your review, before you even start reading the paper to begin with, if the structure is going to be different. Thank you for pointing that out. It'll help make my slides better.
I have another related question to this actually, which is about the percentage rating.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
started ignoring that. Do editors use that? Should I not be ignoring it?
I don't use it. I'm sure there's individual differences and some people may use it. So for many journals, I think the APA journals are like, do you do this? You select a like overall rating from 0 to 100 of the paper. First of all, like how am I ever as a reviewer going to do that? But I generally have an idea if I think it's like a 70 to 80%, which is like almost there after a revision. You know, it's good. I think this paper is heading towards a publication after a revision of some concerns that I have, versus like a 40 to 50% where I'm like, I'm skeptical this is going to move forward, versus like a 20% where I'm like, this is not going to move forward. So I kind of have these like, you know, tiers that I just put in a number based on those tiers personally.
Thanks. There's a question in the chat.
Yeah, so the question is about this gatekeeping idea, and it's a better worded question than I said it originally. So what extent should you take into account the journal and its impact factor when doing a review? Or is that the job of the editor to be the gatekeeper with regard to fit to the journal? That is my opinion, that it is a job of the editor to determine fit. Occasionally as an editor, I have missed a fit and I have had a reviewer being like, this is actually not children, and this journal only publishes about children. I'm like, oh shit, I'm bad. And it's missed a couple editorial reviews, and then you make a decision, you know, based on kind of that. But that, I mean, once in my career, and I don't know how many people I reviewed at this point, or handled as an editor at this point in my career. So it's really uncommon generally. So typically the editorial process is the editor-in-chief does an initial review of the paper and either does a desk rejection or passes along the paper to an associate editor. The editor themselves doesn't typically do most of the action editing, the action editing of a paper. An associate editor at most journals does that. So if there's associate editors in a journal, those are the people who are going to be finding reviewers and things like that. So the editor-in-chief just does the initial desk reject, it's out of scope, or it's, you know, you're doing inferential statistics with 4 children. We're not going to accept that here at this journal, and move on. Then the associate editors get it, and the associate editors themselves can do another review. So they review it themselves and determine if they think it's a desk rejection or not. And so it's 2 levels of editors that are looking for, editor-in-chief definitely looking for fit, and then an associate editor looking with more content expertise, thinking, is this a desk rejection based on my content expertise, or should it go out for review? So it's already 2 sets of eyes at most journals that are looking at a paper, and that's their job, in my opinion. They're thinking about impact, if that's something that they're concerned about at their journal, and they're thinking about fit, which all journals are typically thinking about fit. So I do not think as a reviewer, if it's come to my desk and I've accepted the review, many people have already decided that they think that the impact is probably good enough, and that the fit is fine. And I just don't consider that. I never consider impact, even when like Science or Nature asked me to review a paper. I first of all think that their reliance on impact is too high, and I think if it's solid science, it should get published there. So they'll never have me respond. I'll never gatekeep based on my perceived impact level. But I think a lot of people, if somebody else was giving this workshop right now, would disagree with me on that they think that impact should be considered. It's just my own viewpoint. I just hate gatekeeping generally, so I keep that up in my reviewing. Okay, well, there you can see you've all had access to the slides, and so there were a few more slides are just kind of like what happens editorially, what happens on the other side, just as a reminder that, you know, you're not giving, you might give a broad recommendation of accept, revise, and resubmit, or reject, or other combinations, but really in the end, it's the editor's decision of whether it's an accept, or reject, or revise, and resubmit. And you're just giving general recommendations to make the paper better as you see based on your expertise. Again, just some notes about how, especially when you're starting out, you're probably going to get a lot of papers that you say reject to, because the quality when you first start is not going to be as good as when you get later in your career. The quality of the papers that you get are better. It's very rare for me to recommend reject these days of the paper that I get. Oh, in the submission, you will see a field for comments to the editor, but know that that field is very rarely used. So you don't need to put anything in that field. You'll just cut and paste your review into the comments to the reviewer. And then the editor will make their decision based on your review and the other reviewers. You'll often get blind carbon copied on the decision letter to the authors of what is happening with their paper. And why it's useful, especially when you're starting, is you'll see the other reviewer comments as well. And I think it's a useful practice to do a quick look at what they said, to kind of calibrate your own review process, and just to kind of learn a little bit from what the other reviewers saw from the papers as well. And as a final note, if you're a reviewer and it ends up being as a revise and resubmit, it's kind to agree to review the revision, and a puppy will get a treat somewhere in the world if you do that, and not reject after a revision. Please, as an editor, I say that. And then there's some other online resources, and actually my colleague Jeff Logan is down the hall. I actually mentioned she has a couple other resources I'm going to tuck into this slide. I think she's popped them into my inbox while we've been talking, for you all, so you can always just come back to these slides. I'm happy to hear any recommendations for how any other questions you have, or any other way I could have made these slides more useful, so that you could learn better about how to review a paper. And that's it, I think.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was amazing. I think that was very helpful for a lot of early researchers.
Okay,
so if there's any more questions, then I think it's the time, or otherwise I'm sure Sarah would be happy to answer through email, or you can always email it to MCLS trainee and we can send it through Sarah. So thank you again, Sarah. That was really great.
Yeah, thank you. You can find me on Twitter too if you want to.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Okay. And we'll see you on the 5th of December if you want to join for the MCLS conference in 2023.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
See ya.
Thank you.